All right, well, we're going to get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. You guys were unlucky and drew the late card. We just got done with a meeting before this. Um, my name's Kendall. I'm the county conservationist. I don't know if you guys were at the plant or the Meet Your Scientist meeting 2 years ago, but I just want to go through quickly how to access all the information you're going to hear tonight on our county website. On your postcard, there was a little link on there, but I'll just go through it quick once if you start from scratch. Let's see if I can make this work. So here's our county website, the homepage. You just go up the departments here, click on that, scroll down to the land and water conservation. Once you get here, you're gonna look on the left side at these tabs. Feel free to browse any of them, but the one you want is in the dark blue. There's the bottom here, the county waterways and aquatic invasive species. And in here, we got everything about the lakes that we've got in our department. Talking about invasive species, we got our Healthy Waters Cost Share program you may be interested in down the road. The bottom here, our county cost share program that works on shoreline restoration and erosion problems. The main one here is the countywide lake study. So you click on that, and that'll take you in to all the links this study that we're doing. The top ones are operational strategy and plan was adopted, the countywide lake survey results. This was a countywide survey that Dale will talk a little bit about. The individual lake summaries and plans. So your summary for Wescott Lake will be, you click in here and go in, and it's got, I guess I can just go in there and show you. It's got all the lakes in here, and you can see some of these have a final lake management plan, some have a draft, but the summaries for all of them. And these are the ones that have been studied so far. So you can go in, and Wescott's right down here, just a summary, because we're going to be starting on the draft after tonight. But get back to this. So back a page. The other thing of importance on here is this one right in here is the all lake summary. Ryan put this together, and it compares all the lakes side by side in charts and that. So it's pretty interesting to look if you want to see how you compare to other lakes. And the one down here is the project update. That's updated. We try to do it quarterly, but at least twice a year. And it's Dale will talk a little more about it, but it's the progress we are on certain lakes that are in the study at the time. Then down below is the individual lake surveys. We encourage everyone to take that. You just find your lake, click on it, and it's just a quick survey on your opinion on the lake, what you like about it, don't like, and so on. Also of note, you guys are downstream from Lucille Lake. So if you use Lucille Lake, you can take their survey too. You don't have to be a property owner to take that survey. So we encourage everyone, if you haven't taken it, take it. Everyone in the household can take it. It's not just one per household. It's just opinion on people that use the lake. So that's all I have right now. I'm going to turn it over to Dale, let him talk a little bit, and then we'll get right into Ryan's.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dale Moore with the UW Extension here in Oconto County. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the history before we get into the actual planning results that Ryan and Brenda and Tammy are going to go over. The history helps set the stage for how we got here and why, just because the plan is going to be finished next year, this summer, it shouldn't end. We really want to express that this has been a long effort at the county level, and that we're trying our best to try to set all the pegs in the right holes and get everything going the right way so that the county doesn't overlook this down the road once we have the plans, and we can try to help the lakes that really need it. So with that, a little bit of our history is that, let's see here. There's a number of competing issues at the county. In most cases, as the lake issues started to arise, people would be like, why doesn't the county just deal with this? We're a large county, very much like the others within northern Wisconsin. We're sort of unique in the fact that most of our water resources are in the upper third of the county in this large circle. We have over 300 lakes to deal with. 270 some have names. We also have the bay to the southeast. That's where the county courthouse is. We also have a situation where we have 31 supervisors, three of which are really in those lake areas. So when people are up there, whether they're mostly seasonal rather than year round, the priority just didn't have the needed effort behind it in the past. So dealing with tight budgets, law enforcement, highway, and health and human services are really the top three. So water, lake management really wasn't a key issue, and we noticed that. And the reason that we came up with concerns is that Land and Water Conservation Department, Ken's office, develops a plan every 5 years that looks out for a 10-year period. And to get that plan underway, we bring in environmentalists, folks that live along the waterways, agribusiness folks, and we get them in a room for a few days, and we ask them questions on what their key issues are. And we were just inundated with so much, and Ken and I, we really became a little bit frustrated. We asked them what was their overall vision in this, and they said they really wanted the healthiest waters in Wisconsin, but we really needed to address key issues. So Ken and I, we left the meeting. We were a bit frustrated with the whole thing because we just have our two offices and limited staff. But what we came away with is that we thought if we could get more people, many hands to make light work, and not just rely on Ken's office and myself, and try to at least tag team with other departments, we could actually make some big headway. We also thought that if we didn't deal with all 300 lakes at one time, if we could look at the lakes in a which ones could be most threatened, would probably be the best payoff for us. The other thing that we looked at of the three is we need to get awareness out there, whether it's our county supervisors, our local government, even our lake association, or those that don't have an association at all. How do we build up this swelling of people that are concerned about the waterways, the lakes, and get them all pointed in the same direction at least? Regarding the many hands, we do have land and water staff, our office, DNR biologists and fisheries, the staff from UW Stevens Point. We have the lake districts, associations, as well as groups. Oclala was rebuilt in a sense over the last few years, and with them, they developed with us a conduit called the Citizen Advisory Group that meets quarterly. They bring us their concerns. We feed them issues that the county's thinking about, and we now have this communication that we never had before in the previous decades. We also rely on the lake volunteers. So there's many people now, and it's not just a two-person show in a sense. And part of this is the lake management plans that we're dealing with. So having a larger group has really worked out in our benefit at the county. Making awareness and listening and discussing, part of this awareness and through Stevens Point affiliation is that we were able to do a survey that went countywide. It was a scientific survey of 400 respondents. We have our individual lake surveys as well, but we took that feedback from the public and we didn't just sit on it. We took it and we presented it to each of the county departments within the county. That included Sheriff's Office to the Health and Human Resources Department, Parks and Rec down to Highway. And they all had something to deal with water, okay, and having water issues. We sat in a room and we started to talk about what we could do to make things better and to address those concerns of the survey. And those results became a document, which then went in front of the county board. And out of the 31 supervisors, they voted unanimously to adopt that document as a guide for each of the departments. So annually, we go through that document. We are to work with each of the departments to see if they can enhance some of the things for our waterways. So that was a big step that we've never done before. We've developed the website so that once we do develop data collection and maps, and that people don't have to go looking for this, it's going to be a one-stop shop. And Ken just showed you that. We also have presentations that we've been giving to. We've invited the lake associations, and others to come in front of the county board. And the county was so impressed that they gave a pool of money, about $230,000, to help with a lot of the efforts for the waterways. So we haven't had that before. So it's nice that we've taken that awareness level and gotten it to where it needs to be. And now we don't want it to fall on its face. We want to keep it going forward. Next was when we were looking at the lakes, we're trying to deal with how can we deal with the 300 lakes. We looked at the ones that have public access, and that's how your lake got selected. Public access. It may or may not have had a planning done before, that sort of thing. Let's get it in the hopper. So of the lakes that we have 60 of them that have public access to them. We thought those would probably be the most likely to be endangered due to the high user rate of boats coming in and out of the waterway. So that's why we really focused on 60. We realized we can't do 60 in 2 years. It's a 2-year planning cycle for each of the lakes. We can't do 60 in a 2-year period. So it's always got this hopscotch sort of effect. Every year that we're done with the first year, we're already planning for the first year down the road of another 6 lakes. So it's 6 lakes every year that we're doing with a 2-year cycle for each lake. We thought that this might get a little bit confusing for folks. So we developed an update document that goes out to lake associations, and we're hoping that gets pushed out. It's on our website, but it really goes over each of the goals that we're attempting to do, whether it's inventory of plant growth, that sort of thing. It's going to have the dates that it's been planned for. Those lakes that are done are part of this, so that we really are trying to keep everybody that has an interest in knowing where they are in the 2-year cycle. So this 8-page document goes over a lot of how you can contact us, how you can find the website. It's a hard copy, so it can go out to the public and that sort of thing. So really, it's something that we think has been working, and we try to update it, like Ken says, at least twice a year. And that's the specific spot on the website where you can actually download the latest one that we just completed. So really in a snapshot, that's our history and how we got here. Ryan's going to talk a little bit now, I think, maybe Tammy, I'm not really quite sure, but the key that they're going to mention is that we can't just stop here with this project. That as you listen to the information tonight, we really want you to think what you could do for your water body that you're looking at, and what we can do to continue the process. So if there's no questions to that, I'll turn it over to Ryan or Tammy at this time, and I'll turn this one off.
Yeah, I'll get us started here. Let's see. Back to here. Okay. Thank you guys for attending. My name is Ryan Haney. I work with UW Stevens Point, and as Dale mentioned, we're partnered with the county in conducting this process. And I'm just gonna. Some of you have been to earlier meetings in this process, and maybe you haven't. So I just wanted to give you a quick orientation. Excuse me. There's going to be, you've already received a lot of information, and I'm not going to let up on that pace at all here. So you're going to get a lot. I like it when we can meet in person, because I can put hard copies of some of this stuff in your hands to take home and read and stuff right now. Right now, if you'd like a hard copy of either the report specific to Wescott Lake or the countywide plan, you can contact Ken or Dale for a hard copy. Otherwise, they are available to view online, and I'm just going to kind of present a summary here real quick and show you how we're going to go about this. So first, why a lake management plan? If you're not aware, lake management plan is really just it's a clearinghouse of information on your lake. So different people are doing things on your lake. You may have a lake association doing things. You may have a local sportsman's group doing activities on your lake. Of course, the DNR is involved in different things on your lake. The highway department, has the road going right by the lake. So there's a lot of entities involved. And so a lake management plan is really to be a one document that houses everything we know about the lake. and not just what we know about it, but also coupled with the visions, goals, and objectives that the people that live there really and the users of the lake have in mind for Wescott. And so this is really a plan that's supposed to portray your perceptions and what you would like to see happen on this lake, paired with some hard data that we've collected and what we know about it. And that said, this is a living document, so it needs to be updated periodically when new information comes into place. We've had a lot of volunteers helping us collect water samples, for example. People may have assisted with the plant survey. So we hope that some of this monitoring will continue for Wescott Lake, and that new information will continually be added to this. And if you're doing active stuff on your lake, if you're dealing with weeds, or chemicals or harvesting or doing things like that, the plan needs to be updated a little more frequently. If everything's hunky-dory and things are just happening along, it can happen every 10 years or so. But we recommend you visit it annually to update it with maybe some progress that you've made with some of these different goals, or just include new information. And so again, this is supposed to be a document not only where you can find anything out about the lake, but that where different agencies and entities can see the lake in a comprehensive sort of view instead of just the one little stat that they're interested in. I might also say that these are increasingly required to be eligible for state resources. So for grants, things like that. If you're responding to invasive species, if you're looking for a grant to do some shoreline restorations or stocking or whatever the thing might be, because there's so much demands on those funds these days, particularly with the explosion of invasive species around the state, the DNR really wants to direct those resources to lakes and lake groups that have a comprehensive view of their lake and aren't just tunnel vision zeroed in on one particular subject, and that they demonstrate an understanding. And that's what this plan is intended to do. Again, to orient you in the process, what we did was conducted a 2-year lake study starting back in 2018 on Wescott Lake. That included a number of topics I'm going to go over here. And what that did was really create some baseline data for the lake. Some of the lakes in this process had previous data, some had a little, some had a lot. For many of these lakes, I think Wescott is in that boat where this is some of the first data on some of these topics that's ever been collected. So it really is the baseline going forward. So we completed the 2-year study, and I'm going to kind of present the results of that here this evening, and then we'll develop a management plan, which will basically take that information and put it in the context of goals going forward. What do we want to preserve? What would we like to change? What needs to be fixed? Various things like that. Once we have a document that everyone's happy with, this document will go to the DNR, it'll go to the township, it'll go to the county, and be on file in all these various places so that it's available for reference to whether it be the highway department or the parks department or DNR, whomever is going to be undertaking an activity on or near the lake, to see what all is going on at this lake and where that lake is going. So lake management plans are under Chapter NR 193 in the code, and so a comprehensive lake management plan incorporates all these elements here in this list. And so whether that be physical data, the water samples, the hard science, whether it be the watershed and what sort of land use is going on in the watershed, maybe it's land ownership around the lake or habitat assessments, There's some modeling that's involved, of course, fisheries data, and then public information. Who owns the boat launch? What are the ordinances? All this information gets wrapped into this document, and so it's a lot of ground to cover. It's a lot of information. So what I've proposed to your lake group is in the process we've kind of been following is that I take this information and I basically create a draft of a lake management plan. And I've already started that here, and you can see some of the pages from Wescott's plan right here. But I synthesize all that information, and it's divided into chapters. So whether it be a chapter about plants, whether it be a chapter about recreation and boating, or a chapter about water quality, what have you, presents the information. And in the last page of each chapter, and on the bottom right, you'll see is goals, objectives, and actions for that particular subject. And that's really where we need your input, your lake group's input, and the people that are familiar with the lake's input. And so the process that we found that works is I create a plan. I even start to insert some goals and objectives and some action items as guidance, as ideas based on my experience working with various lakes around the state. And so what we'll do is I'll create this draft, and then that will come out in the coming weeks as an email to you guys. We have your email there who's attending tonight. The email can easily be forwarded to anyone else you think might be interested in taking a look. And basically, I'd have you review this plan and then comment on it. So you can either reply to my email, you can give me a call, you can talk to Ken or Brenda or Tammy at DNR about your concerns or your thoughts. And we will incorporate those ideas as they come into this plan. And that'll just kind of be an iterative process. I'll put out a new draft as I get comments, and then once we get a plan and a document that everyone is happy with, then we'll submit that for approval to the DNR and to go on file there. So that's something that'll happen in the coming weeks and months as you get an opportunity. I've had some lake groups get together as a committee to go over the plan and discuss it. Other times I just get comments from individuals. However you see that happening is up to you guys. And we'll talk a bit more about that at the end. So our first topic, we're going to cover fisheries, and we have, I might mention, we have Tammy Paoli, the DNR fish biologist for the area, on with us to present on fisheries. And I'll also mention we have Brenda Nordine, the lake biologist for the area, on with us tonight too, as well as Ken and Dale. So some good resources here. So speak up if you have questions. There's also, if you know how to use the chat function, you can submit a question with text, and we'll also give you some time to comment and talk at the end. So with that, Tammy.
It might help if I unmute my other button here. Sorry. Oh boy. All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to give you some updates on Wescott Lake fisheries. This picture was actually taken a couple of years ago when we were there for a survey. It's one of my favorite pictures where, it's just was a really neat sunset that night. So just wanted to start off by giving a few, quick facts about the lake. Wescott Lake is a fairly small lake, 38 acres. It's a drainage lake, meaning that it, neighboring Usa Lake drains into it. The max depth that I have from one of our databases is 27 feet, averaging 14 feet. The substrate is composed of muck and sand, and the shoreline is mostly upland hardwoods. The size of the lake is important because how we determine our fisheries survey rotations. 100 acres is a pretty important number for a cutoff of lakes that we would most likely spend a little bit more time in. 100 acres plus having a public access, of course. And so because this lake falls less than that, we don't spend as much time in it as we might in some bigger lakes, but we still do have regular surveys in this lake, and I'll show you some of those results here shortly. So Wescott Lake currently follows our general inland fishing regulations right now, particularly for largemouth bass. Our daily limit is 5 bass, 14 inches or greater, and I'll talk more a little bit about that later on. But for the rest of the species, this is what the general inland regulations are. There are no special regulations on the lake at this time. The stocking history, pretty minimal, which is a good thing. That means there probably hasn't been any major issues, or of course no winter kills on record for this lake that we've had to stock a bunch of fish. Looks like walleye were tried for a couple of years. The lake is really too small for walleye to do well at all. Some pike were stocked as fry in 1986, and then some smallmouth bass purchased from a private group or individual were stocked in 1998, and that's the only stocking history that I have. So in 2019, we did an electrofishing survey of Wescott Lake on June 10th, and this was a nighttime survey. The boat here shows the survey that is performed in the daytime, but just to give you an idea of how this works, this is what our electrofishing boat looks like. There are 2 dippers on the front of the boat. There are 2 booms that hang out in front of the boat that put a temporary electrical current in this front area of the boat, enough to stun the fish, and the dippers can scoop them up and put them in the tank back here to recover. And so this is one of our methods that we use for what we call electrofishing, spring electrofishing surveys. So when we're really interested in looking at the bass and panfish, we use this method in late May and early June to survey along the shoreline. And it's really only effective in 5 feet of water or less. So on June 10th, 2019, we did a nighttime survey. We surveyed the entire 1.17 miles of shoreline. And the last time that this type of survey was done was in 2009. So it's generally on a 10-year rotation. The timing worked out perfectly because, of course, I wanted to get some more up-to-date information, knowing that this lake management plan was coming up into this time frame. So what did we find? We had 130 fish of 7 species. Largemouth bass were most abundant. We also commonly saw bluegill and pumpkin seed. And then present, but in smaller numbers, were black crappie, northern pike, yellow perch, and yellow bullhead. So just taking a look at bluegill, this is a length frequency graph that shows the number sampled on this side, and then the length 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 inch. So as you can see, we did get pretty good numbers of 5, 6, and even 1 7-inch bluegill during the survey, as well as some smaller 3-inch bluegill, which is good to see. Obviously that means there's some up and comers, but we didn't see any major signs that they were that we didn't have anything large enough that people would be willing to harvest. Our largemouth bass length frequency, these are clustered into some inch bins, so 5 to 8 inch, 8 to 11 inch, 11 to 14, and then 14 and up legal size. So we did see, I guess this was about 10 or so largemouth bass that were of a legal size to be harvested, and then the rest were smaller. And you can see the numbers here, 23 or so bass in this 11 to 14 inch bin, and that's quite a bit for only shocking just over a mile. So what we determine is that we have a high density, meaning a high number of moderately slow growing largemouth bass. We calculated it to be 69 largemouth bass per mile. So comparing that to neighboring Seal Lake, where we had 30 largemouth bass per mile, we obviously have a much higher density of bass in Wescott Lake. And that'll become important here when I'm talking about some regulation things in the future. So one question that we ask sometimes when we collect some species of fish, we want to know how fast or slow growing they are, and that gives us an idea of if they're overabundant. Are they competing with each other for food resources? Essentially, is what that tells us. So that's why we often will collect aging structures from some fish. So how long does it take a largemouth bass in Wescott Lake to reach a legal size of 14 inches? So if we take a line and draw from this 14 inch across, this dark gray line is our 2019 survey results, and the light gray is other largemouth bass average ages that we would see in this part of the state. So you can see our ages of largemouth bass are a little bit under what we would typically see, with the exception of these couple up here. And then we draw that line down, boom, it comes out to about 7 years. We would typically see in an average lake, this would take about 6 years for a bass to get to 14 inches. So a little bit slower growing than what we would like to see. And that's often something that we see when we see high densities of bass, that they just grow slower because there's not as much food to go around. So in conclusion, we say that Wescott Lake has a high density of moderately slow growing largemouth bass. It's not the slowest growing that we've ever seen, but moderately slow growing. Wescott Lake is sparsely developed with a lack of large woody debris around the shoreline. Despite the fact that there are some cottages around there, there's still a lot of really nice shoreline, but there really is not a lot of woody debris around the lake at all. So we certainly would encourage any property owners who are interested to think about fish sticks, which are whole trees that are dropped into the water and attached to the shoreline. So that's something that could be considered to help improve the fish population in the future. Now, the biggest thing I wanted to talk about and get some input from others, maybe not necessarily tonight, tonight's fine too, but also, I haven't, just looking for feedback in the future. So people can email me, call me, spread the word to your neighbors and other people on the lake that we're thinking about this, and I'd like to get some input. I'm thinking about a regulation change for largemouth bass. Currently, the regulation is 14 inch minimum, 5 bass per day. But we're thinking of trying a no minimum size, 5 per day. But before we would ever pursue that, I need to know that there's local support needed. And if the majority of the people said, no, I'm not in favor of that change, I'd like it how it is, then we wouldn't pursue it. But if I heard from enough people that said, yeah, I think we ought to try changing the bass regulation, that might reduce the density of bass. It might increase the growth rates of bass. So we might have fewer bass, but you might be more likely to catch some bigger bass. So that's something that we might want to try. Because we're on a 10-year rotation, the next electrofishing survey is planned for 2029. After we did our 2019 survey, there was a fisheries report that was written. It's posted on our website. The link is shown here. However, you can also email me and I can send you the report directly. It includes some of the graphs that I showed you, but a lot more information and some more details. And, you know, most importantly, I'm really interested in having folks to contact me with their thoughts on a bass regulation change. I included my email here. And again, you know, just hoping, I know we don't have a ton of people on this call, was hoping for some more. And without the lake having an organized lake association, it's hard to get input on such a regulation. And changing a regulation is very time consuming. It's a long process. It takes many years. There's a lot of steps involved. And so to do so, you know, I need to know that there's public support. And actually one of the things that I need to fill out to propose a regulation change, I need to show that I actually have contacted those on the lake or that would use the lake, and there is support for this too. So again, this is something that is, you know, would be recommended if others are interested in it. So I really am looking for some feedback on your thoughts based on your experiences on the lake for largemouth bass. And I believe that was my last slide. And so I guess Ryan, do we have a few minutes to open it up for questions about fisheries, or should we move on to the next section?
I'm muted. Yes, absolutely. If anyone has any questions, you can unmute yourself and shout away if you got something for Tammy. Any opinions on the regulation change from you folks?
Ryan, there is one. It says we would agree on bass size change. We catch a lot just below the 14-inch in summer.
Okay.
And that was from Ryan.
Okay.
Okay, that's good to hear. Ryan, you, if you're able to, could you shoot me an email if you have an email, basically kind of saying the same thing. And that way I can kind of start keeping another record of what people's thoughts are, and then I'll have your email to correspond with you in the future. Perfect.
And this is a perfect example of where this management plan creation will help inform people like Tammy about what the people at the lake would like to see done. So we'll hopefully get some more feedback through this plan drafting as well.
Right, like I said, spread the word to your neighbors and other people that fish the lake. They don't necessarily have to be own a place on the lake, just people that spend time on the lake, and have them get a hold of me, whether they're in favor or against such a regulation change, because I need to know. I need to hear from more people, and it's really hard on a lake like this. You know, it's one of the few lakes that I work on that really doesn't have an organized group that I can just contact one person and say, hey, can I come and talk to your meeting the next time you guys meet? So I'm kind of struggling with figuring out how to get some better public input. So hopefully we can hear from some more people through this process.
Thank you, Tammy. Let's see here. Okay, continuing on, that's a good segue. I already have a couple things for our plan. One would be addressing the potential regulation change and the status of the fishery, and another is something as basic as you know, if not creating, possibly creating a lake association, but if not a full-blown association, creating a mechanism for folks around the lake to communicate news or ideas or things like that. So we'll be looking for that in the plan, or be looking for that in the plan as well, for some potential ideas. Okay, I'm going to continue on with and summarize some of the other information we collected here. I'll try and get through this pretty quick here. And first of all, I just want to give you some context here in that lakes go through a natural aging process. They are low spots in the landscape, kind of like your moat around a sandcastle at the beach. Things flow into it, and it's a very natural process. And given enough time, lakes will eventually fill up completely. That's just how they work. And eventually, someday, some other geologic event, maybe another glaciation will happen and create new lakes. But most of the lakes in this area are around 10,000 years old. They're left over from the last glaciation in this area. And when lakes are first formed, as blocks of ice are left in place, or other dynamics associated with the glacier, we start off with a relatively young lake that's relatively sandy bottomed, few plants, few animals, not a lot going on. And then as sediment flows into the lake over time, as plants and animals die, we start to accumulate muck and sediment and these deposits on the bottom of the lake. But with that comes more activity. There's more food for wildlife to eat, and that process continues. And given enough time, the lake will become a marsh or a wetland someday, and eventually solid ground. And so it's a very natural process. The lake is doing exactly what it's supposed to do and responding to the inputs that are affecting it. So our ability to manipulate a lake is somewhat limited. At best, we can kind of nudge it in one direction or the other. Our activities on the landscape around a lake tend to accelerate this aging process. And so a lot of times we're looking for ways to just kind of slow this down. We don't want to lose our lake. We kind of like it how it is. But the important thing is to recognize that that we have to have realistic expectations for our lake. So we're not going to be able to ever turn this lake into a swimming pool or anything like that. It is what it is in a lot of ways, and we can kind of nudge it in certain directions if we like. Important thing to think about is what is the water cycle involved in our lake? So where's our water coming from and where's it going? In general, the water cycle is that precipitation falls on the land. Some of that precipitation runs across the surface and into our lakes as surface runoff, and some of it gets a chance to infiltrate into the ground and become groundwater. The difference is that groundwater moves to the lake much slower. It's kind of a reserve account of water that feeds our lake, and that water has a chance to be filtered through the rock and soil, whereas runoff has a lot more energy. It tends to carry contaminants and pollutants with it, cause erosion, things like that. So you'll see a general theme in some of these ideas and suggestions about how we can lessen runoff and increase infiltration for the health of our lake. Of course, yours is a drainage lake, so you're getting a large proportion of your water flowing out of Lucille Lake. And I'll show you here the watershed. So the impacts to Wescott are also what is impacting Lucille impacts Wescott. So there's a lot of opportunities here, and I think it's a good place for possibly Wescott to work with UCEAL on some things if those things are identified, and to team up with some of these other lakes. So what shapes a lake's character? As I talked about the age of the lake. I talked a little bit about lake type. Yours is a drainage lake, so most of the water is coming in a stream and leaving via a stream. Other types of lakes are seepage lakes, where it's receiving most of its water through groundwater. Wescott is also receiving a considerable amount of water through groundwater as well. So from both of those mechanisms. The geology and the soil types around a lake affect it. That certainly the topography around a lake affects it. That affects how big your watershed is, and how big your watershed is incorporates that many more land uses. You'll notice Wescott's different than Lucille, and both of those are different than Maiden or Kelly, all located in the same spot. And so you can see how different a lake can behave even in the same region based on some of these variables here. We have seasonal environmental changes to the lake. Here in Wisconsin, our lakes freeze over every year. And that definitely has an effect on the ecosystem of the lake. When you work on lakes down in Georgia or Florida, their lakes don't freeze over. And that's something that definitely has to get incorporated into the planning and understanding of the lake. Land use within the watershed, as I mentioned, and then nearshore activities. The closer you get to a lake, the greater impact your activity has on that lake. So part of this process, the DNR used sonar and went out and created a new bathymetric contour map of Lucille Lake. Most lakes were mapped over 50 years ago, drilling holes through the ice and lowering down a rope to see how far it went. Now we do continuous scan with sonar. So we have this updated map here that is available electronically. Not a lot has changed in a lot of these lakes in that time, but the resolution's a little bit better. And if this is something you can get a hold of electronically and even put it in your fish finder or something like that. So pretty handy to have. We mentioned the survey a couple of times. I just want to reiterate that. We have an online survey for anyone who uses the lake to take. It kind of gives your perceptions, your opinions, your ideas about the lake. It's most important, certainly for people who can't attend these meetings, to be able to contribute their thoughts. But the survey is also a good way to quantify everyone's opinions, as opposed to just thinking you know what all your neighbors think. This survey will really put that all together for us, and particularly when someone like Tammy needs to know about regulation changes, things like that, these surveys can be really important. So we'll be spending the coming weeks developing this plan. So if you haven't yet, I encourage you to take the survey. There's a link to it in the email for tonight's meeting, and I will also send out additional links when I send out the draft. But I encourage you to take it, other people in your house, neighbors, whomever. The more responses we get, the better. This is just one of the questions from the survey. I only had a handful of responses so far, but what do you value most about Wescott Lake? No wake and the loons were the two responses on that I got. And in your opinion, what are the biggest impacts to Wescott Lake? Algae blooms was the only comment I got for that question. So I don't know how many of you concur with that or experience that, but we'll see what we can see in the data regarding that. So whenever we go out and take a water sample, we go out to a central location, a determined location in the lake to take our sample. And while we're there taking the sample, we also drop some meters in the water and collect some information. One of those is temperature. And so here's a graph of the different sampling events on Wescott. Each of those colored lines is a different visit to the lake. And the way this is oriented is the surface of the lake is at the top, and it goes down with depth, and then we have temperature across the top there. And so each time we went out, you can see temperature at the surface typically starts off, close to the air temperature was at the time, as you would expect. And then as we go down deeper into the water, our temperature drops off and gets cooler until we reach about 40-45 degrees, which is, pretty much the temperature of groundwater. What this shows is that, what this mainly is showing is that Wescott Lake is deep enough that it stratifies. And so you can see we have near surface or near air temperatures near the surface. But once you get down about 5, and in a lot of events closer to 10 feet, that temperature really drops off. And then as it gets closer to 45, 50, 55 feet, it starts to stabilize again. And so that's indicative of a thermocline in the lake, which separates warm water on the surface from cold water on the bottom. And that has a lot of implications when it comes to chemistry, fish, things like that. The one brown line there at 45 degrees going down was collected, when was that? November 7th, 2018. So that was in fall overturn. And so twice a year, the lake, the water on the surface of the lake starts to cool as winter comes, and it approaches the same temperature as water deep in the lake. And that is indicated by that line. You can see I recorded nearly a constant temperature with depth from the surface all the way down. When that happens, that thermocline disappears and allows all the water to mix. And that happens again in the spring as the surface water starts to warm up. That's important to know, that your lake stratifies, at what depth it stratifies, and when that mixing occurs, a lot of different things can happen. So water clarity, in addition to temperature, water clarity is something we look at. You can see in the photo there, it's just, we call that a Secchi disk, and really all water clarity is how far light penetrates into the lake. And that's a standardized disc that essentially you lower it down and see how deep it goes before it disappears. And that gives us our reading. It's pretty crude, but it's very effective. But water clarity can be affected by the water's color, maybe tannins from wetlands, or certainly sediment being stirred up. You're a no-wake lake, but lakes that allow wake speeds definitely see different water clarities on weekends, for example, than they do midweek. Also, algae blooms, things like that can affect the water clarity. And so the point being, water clarity can be different from one day to the next. So a single measurement, or even a handful of measurements, are only tell you so much. What's important is if you take these measurements consistently over time, you can start to see trends. And it ends up being a very inexpensive and easy way to detect if something is changing in your lake. So if we look at the water clarity in Wescott Lake, the only data we have is for the past few years, and so this is an extremely limited data set when it comes to something like water clarity. Like I said, you can see how variable the results can be from time to time. And so what's important here is that volunteers or people continue to monitor this water clarity over time, so that we can develop this data set more completely and really start to see a trend. Based on the limited samples I have here, that dashed yellow line is the trend for those samples. And basically that suggests that the water clarity in recent years is stable in Wescott. It's not changing significantly one way or the other, but that would be hard to say for sure until we get some more longer term data. Like I said, these lake studies are some of the first data collected for some of these lakes, so hopefully there'll be more going forward. Dissolved oxygen is another thing we monitor. Obviously, oxygen in the water is required for fish to breathe, and plants and algae kick off that oxygen. Because our lakes freeze in the winter and those plants die, we cut off our sources of oxygen. So it's important for lakes to have a significant concentration of oxygen in them going into winter. If you've heard of winter fish kills on lakes, that typically happens because the lake ran out of oxygen before the ice melted off, and it could get access to more fresh air. Part of what decaying plants, decaying animals will absorb that oxygen. They use that oxygen in the decay process. So lakes that typically have problems with dissolved oxygen are shallower lakes with a lot of plants, can have oxygen issues. This is similar to our temperature graph. So we measured dissolved oxygen with depth. And similar to temperature, you can see we have pretty consistent concentration of oxygen near the surface, which makes sense where you've got that water, where the air and the water can mix. So, you know, somewhere between 7 to 10 parts per million is pretty common for oxygen concentration in Wescott at the surface. And then as we go down with depth, our oxygen concentrations drop off. And similar to that thermocline, you can see here between about 10, 15, 20 feet, that oxygen drops off significantly. And that's because those differences in temperature between the shallow water and the deep water are preventing that water from mixing. So the shallow water is getting plenty of fresh oxygen from the atmosphere, but that deeper water, oftentimes deeper than even plants are growing, isn't getting any fresh oxygen. And so the concentrations drop off at that thermocline. Again, our November 7th sample, when we were at fall overturn, I told you all that water was mixed because all the water was the same temperature. You can see that brown line at about 8 parts per million, very consistent with depth because all the water surface and at depth was a similar temperature. It was mixing and resupplying that water at depth with fresh oxygen just before going into winter. So I would, you know, you probably don't have issues with fish kills on Wescott too often. I'll also show the pink area of that graph is anything below 5 parts per million oxygen. That's a threshold where many fish species start getting stressed for low oxygen. And so you can see is throughout the year with that thermocline, our oxygen levels drop off by about 10 or 15 feet to where there's probably not a lot of fish hanging out much deeper than that due to lack of oxygen. But even in the winter, most of the year, anything above 10 feet typically has sufficient oxygen. So again, you're not experiencing fish kills, but you're also not going to really develop a significant fish population at depth. By that. I will also say there's a couple of those samples on the right, the green and the blue lines, where they start off at about 8, and then as we go down, they actually go up before they go down. And so you can see again, right there at about 10 feet, those green and blue lines have really bumped up from what it was at the surface. That's indicative of an algae bloom. So algae is reproducing in the water, and just like plants, it's kicking off oxygen as it does its thing. And this is an algae bloom that was probably occurring at depth right around 10 feet. It may or may not have been something you saw, but this profile does show that you are getting some algae blooms in this lake. Nutrients is another thing we look at, primarily phosphorus and nitrogen. We look at these because these are the big drivers for plant growth and algae growth. They're necessary components. We're all composed of phosphorus and nitrogen, so are the plants and the fish. So we need a certain amount of it. Typically problems arise when we get too much phosphorus and nitrogen. When we get excessive plant growth and algae growth. And so sources of phosphorus includes when plants and animals die and decay at the bottom, they kick off phosphorus. Wetlands release a lot of phosphorus when they release their water, and phosphorus really likes to bind to soil particles. So anytime you get erosion or runoff in a storm, any soil particles or sediment that's running into the lake is typically carrying phosphorus with it and adding to that nutrient budget there. Anytime the bottom sediments, again, the phosphorus is locked up in a lot of those bottom sediments. Anytime those are resuspended by boat activity or waves and sometimes even just that overturn event I told you about in spring and fall, that can release phosphorus into the column. And then human sources of phosphorus are erosion, runoff, fertilizers, wastewater from like septic systems, things like that. Those are all contributing phosphorus to the lake. And so if your lake has excessive amounts of plant growth or excessive algae problems, it's probably getting too much nutrient. And of these various sources of nutrient, it's only the ones on the right there. It's only our septic systems. It's only our lawns that we can do anything about. Those other sources we're not going to change. And so that's why a lot of times homeowners and property owners are harped on about their shorelands and stuff like that. It's just because those are, when it comes again to nudging this lake one way or the other, we only have a handful of options available to us. So here's phosphorus and chlorophyll, which is a measure of algae in Wescott. And again, I would look at this and say it's extremely limited data set, just a few years, a handful of samples from each year. But based on that, these concentrations are pretty good. The red line at the top is 40 parts per billion phosphorus. And so for a drainage lake like Wescott, 40 is a threshold where the phosphorus concentrations really start to become a nuisance, become an issue. All of our samples were pretty well below that 40, so that's a good sign. And the trend based on those limited number of samples would suggest that phosphorus is going down, but I wouldn't hang my hat on that trend based on the limited sampling. So again, ongoing monitoring is key to knowing which direction this lake is going, or is it stable? A lot of these lakes are not seeing, particularly Wescott, not seeing a lot of new development. And so a lot of these inputs may have stabilized for the time being. But only future information will tell us. The green dots are the algae we measured, and those are all pretty good. As a rule, you want to kind of stay below 6 for chlorophyll. Anything above 6 starts to become a real nuisance. And your highest measurements were around 4, so that's looking pretty good as well. Pollutants, we measure things like potassium, chloride, sodium in the lake water. In and of themselves, in moderate concentrations, none of these things are really detrimental to the lake. But none of these compounds here are generated in the lake naturally. So they're tracers for us. And so if we see elevated levels of any of these, that's indication that the lake is being impacted by contaminants of various sources. And so potassium was low, but chloride and sodium were elevated in Wescott. And it takes additional study to really start to pinpoint exactly what the sources of those things are. But in general, road salts, ag runoff, and septic systems are usually the primary sources for those chloride and sodium. And so again, they're elevated in Wescott, and so that just shows that we may have an issue somewhere. And with potassium and chloride and sodium comes other things like phosphorus or what have you. So something to look out for. It doesn't necessarily warrant a whole separate study, but we need to keep an eye on some of these common sources of those contaminants. The watershed, just so everyone understands it, the watershed is the area of land that is draining to your lake. So when a drop of water, drop of rain lands on the water surface, it starts taking the path of least resistance to the nearest water body. And so sometimes that's runoff across the surface. As I said before, sometimes it'll get a chance to infiltrate into the groundwater and then make its way to the lake. But that area of land is important to know, because if you need to make changes, or if you want to address some of the inputs of your lake, it's important to know what area of land we're talking about. And so we delineated the watershed for Wescott Lake, which you can see here in the white dashed line. And because you are a drainage lake receiving water from USEAL, USEAL's watershed is also your watershed, and then some. And so you have 634 acres in the watershed. So that's the area of land that has a potential impact on Wescott Lake, which includes Squaw Lake there and USEAL. And land use in that 634 acres is about a third forest, and about 20% lake bodies themselves. We got about 20% of the land is in cropland, and about 10% of that land is development. And then we've got a little more in grassland and wetland. So based on that distribution of land uses, when we put that into a phosphorus model that models soil types, topography, things like that, it gives you, in a nutshell, it gives you what are the biggest sources of phosphorus based on your watershed. And so in the 634 acres, approximately 67% of your phosphorus load would be coming from the cultivated crops in that watershed. 13% is also coming from forests. So any type of land use, even if it's pristine, is going to be exporting phosphorus to your lake. It's just part of the weathering process, but some land uses send a lot more. So I didn't see indication currently that phosphorus is a real problem, but we are seeing algae blooms. We do know we have a lot of plant growth. And so if you want to look to start addressing some of those sources, your biggest piece of the pie is that cropland. Habitat in nearshore areas is an important part of the study. We have a way of surveying this so that, again, we can duplicate that survey in the future and monitor change. Shoreline is very important. You probably, as a lakefront owner, hear a lot about shoreline. It's important because that's where most of the stuff happens. It's where everyone wants to be. It's why we have a house on the lake, but it's also where the fish want to be. It's where the ducks want to be. It's where the reptiles want to be. And so it's a very sensitive and important part of the lake. And there are methods to all live synchronously there. On the bottom, I have a couple of photos there. Those are both pictures of shoreline restoration projects. So those are using native plants and flowers. I just like to include that to encourage people to beef up their shoreline, beef up that habitat. It reduces the nutrient inputs into your lake, and it can actually look very, very aesthetic and very pleasing. The top picture just kind of shows you some contrast between two different property management techniques there, and you can guess where the fish are hanging out on those two properties. So again, here just kind of looking at a cross section of our lake. We have our terrestrial area above the water on the land, and then as you hit the water line, you have your emergent plants, then your floating plants, and then your submerged plants. And then at some point you get to a depth where plants don't grow anymore. That's based on that light penetration I was showing you earlier, how far the light penetrates into the water. So really not a lot happens out there in that open water area. Most of the activity is going on in that littoral zone there where the plants are growing near shore. In fact, 90% of all lake life spends at least part of its life cycle in that shoreland area. It relies on it for either food or reproduction or what have you. So again, it's the most sensitive and key part of our lake. Just to give you some perspective here, this is a combination of a whole bunch of different studies that show the amount of shoreline buffer that would be required for different objectives. So nutrient control, anywhere from 13 to 140 feet of shoreline buffer is required. Stormwater runoff starts at 50 feet. Fecal bacteria, 75 feet. Sediment control, anywhere from 10 to 400 feet. And I always say the wildlife, they'll take whatever they can get. So but there's a huge range there because of different lake types. And so it depends on what your soil type is. It depends on if your site is on a hill or not, whether it faces north or south. All these can have an impact on that. So it creates this range. But that red line there is 35 feet. So the shoreline zoning ordinance that you may be familiar with, which asked for a 35-foot unmowed vegetative buffer along the lakeshore. You can see that even that 35 feet, even the ordinance, is really just the tip of the iceberg for actually accomplishing any of these objectives. And again, the shoreline zoning has been around since the 60s. So this isn't it isn't a new agenda or recent science. This is something that we understood well enough 50 years ago that we put it into law as a state. It's been widely ignored and not very enforced, and a lot of people don't understand it. It can get as technical as you like, but what I like is the picture on the right, which just kind of shows the intent of the ordinance. So getting away from actual measurements and everything, the intent is that that you have a good buffer between your residential area and the water of unmowed vegetation of some sort, whether that be something that you intentionally planted, like the picture there again on the left of a shoreline restoration, or you just leave it unmowed or what have you. It can take a variety of forms and still accomplish the same thing. The ordinance allows for access to the lake. It allows for a pier. It allows for you to clear plants away from that lake, from that pier for your access to the lake. But in general, creates a lot of habitat and good water quality benefits there. So part of the process is surveying the habitat around the shoreline. Again, this is a method that can be duplicated in the future so that you can monitor change. So if there are restoration projects that take place or property changes hands or what have you, you can monitor how your habitat around the lake is changing over time. Based on this, we had about 20%, 19% of the shoreline was considered disturbed. Over 80% is considered undisturbed. For most lakes in the area, that's pretty good numbers. So you do have a lot of undisturbed shoreline, which is good. Of the 6,400 feet of shoreline that we surveyed, there was about 1,000 feet of mowed lawn, and we counted 22 piers, 29 lots, and not a whole lot else. Woody habitat, which Tammy had mentioned, which consists of coarse woody structure, trees, logs, things like that, that are key pieces of habitat. In Wescott Lake, that was measured at approximately 8 logs per mile on average. And so a healthy lake, for comparison, would be on the order closer to 250 logs per mile. And so basically this suggests that there's a lot of room for habitat improvements on Wescott here that is often a lot better. If you're looking to improve the fishery particularly, it's a lot better investment to improve that woody structure than it is to stock fish or something, for example. Just another before and after picture here of another shoreline restoration. Again, I just like to give lots of examples about that it can be it can be not only something that improves your lake, but something that actually improves your property overall. Just a comment here about native plants. A lot of these projects use native plants, which is important. When I talk about unmowed vegetation at the shoreline, I'm not talking about daffodils. So we're talking about what's best is native plants. They're built for this environment, so they're very deep rooted. They prevent erosion. They help absorb nutrient out of the groundwater and the runoff before it goes to the lake. On the surface, they're structured so that they really hold their own against runoff and that spring melt of all the snow. And they kind of act as a silt fence, if you would, for the lake. So native plants are very important. In that red square there on the left, that's Kentucky bluegrass for comparison. So you can see we don't get a lot of advantage from the lawn in terms of habitat or water quality. Other ways to increase infiltration, as I was talking about, in addition to a shoreline buffer, is also rain gardens, retention basins, things like that. Rain barrels, catching water running off your roof, and then you can use that water when it's drier later to water plants. Something as simple as meandering a pathway to the lake instead of having a straight shot down to the lake to remove those conduits for runoff. And then Ken and the land conservation and stuff, they're often working with landowners up in the watershed in terms of best management practices for agriculture, such as cover crops. On the bottom right there, the highway department has learned a lot. Used to, we shunted water off our highways right into the nearest water body to get rid of it. And although we do need to get the water off the roads to be safe, we've learned a lot about how to manage that water as it comes off the road, so that it doesn't impact our water bodies quite as much. And that, again, that's another example of where groups like the highway department being aware of these management plans is another key component, particularly when you have a highway going right by your lake. Aquatic plants is something we look at. They're obviously very important to the lake. They're food and shelter and habitat for our wildlife. They improve our water quality and clarity, prevent erosion, things like that. And the assemblage, the types of species of plants in a lake and the assemblage of those different species, I've always said a good plant biologist can tell me more about your water quality based on the plants than I can with my lab samples. So plants are very good keys to what's happening in a lake. So we have a way of surveying the plants in a lake. We get a grid here, as you see, that goes over the lake. And each one of these grid points has a GPS coordinate. And so what we do is we go out on a boat and we navigate to that coordinate. And there we drop down a rake, kind of like a modified garden rake. And we pull up the plants that are at that location, and we inventory those plants, their abundance, what species they are, things like that. And then we can map those results and monitor change again over time. So here's the results of the survey conducted back in wait, that says Underwood on the right. That's a mistake. But the latest survey here, and this is rake fullness. So when we pull up that rake with plants on it, the first thing we do is we give a number to how much plant material is on that lake or on that rake. Is it just a few sprigs? Is it heaping with plants? And then we can map that based on that grid. And so our red dots, the 3s, are where we had abundant plant growth. The green dots are where we only had a 1 for plant growth. And where you don't see dots, there generally were no plants at that location. Now, we did have a strip through here. I might ask Brenda, or maybe that's just, that might be all at depths beyond plant growth, where we didn't get samples. So it's rather intuitive. We can see where the abundant plant growth is around. Again, what's interesting to see is how that might change over time. When the survey was conducted, they identified 26 different species of aquatic plants in the lake. And at the bottom there is a graph it's one of the graphs out of the countywide report where that compares all the lakes together. And so you can see Wescott is kind of in the upper third with 26 different species. Wescott's kind of in the upper third of the lakes that we've done so far. Generally, a higher number of species is considered a good thing. It's considered good biodiversity, and a more diverse plant community is usually more robust and considered healthier. In addition to the variety of plants, at the right there, each species gets a C value. A C value is a relatively how sensitive is that plant. So a plant with a high C value, and it goes up as high as 10, a plant with a high C value is considered a very sensitive plant, very intolerant of disturbance. So when you see high C value plants, that's a sign of a healthy ecosystem. Lower C-value plants, like we've got curly leaf pondweed in the middle there, is an invasive species. It gets the C-value of 0. It's not a high value plant at all. And so you can see we've got quite a few 8s in there, kind of the gamut, nothing too exceptional. We don't have any 9s or 10s, but all in all, a wide variety of species, which is a good sign. The most common species we identified during the survey was Chara. At over 70% of the sites that were sampled had Chara present. Chara is also known as muskgrass, kind of has a musky smell to it. What's good about Chara is it's very effective at removing phosphorus from the water column. So it's a good plant to have in your lake in terms of managing nutrient. It's also a great plant because it grows relatively close to the bottom. It kind of carpets the bottom of the lake. So it can be abundant, but not be a nuisance because it stays down near the bottom. So it's not the type of plant that gets caught in your prop or something like that. Also, because it carpets the bottom, it's very effective at keeping other species from taking root in that area, i.e. an invasive species. So if you have a good healthy share of Chara, it's that more likely it'll keep things like milfoil from coming in. The next most popular plant was northern water milfoil, which is a native species of milfoil. Looks very similar to the invasive and is often mistaken for it, but it's a decent plant at 20% of the sites. And then the white water lily, which is probably not a lot of people's favorites because that's a floating plant and is often a recreational nuisance, but nonetheless is very healthy for the lake, helps keep the water cool, shades the water, things like that at 17% of the sites. Another thing that was observed was filamentous algae, and so this is an algae bloom that occurs as opposed to the graph we saw of my dissolved oxygen, where we had algae bloom at depth. Filamentous algae is often on the surface. It's long and stringy. It was identified at a handful of sites there. You can see on the map with the green dots. And that's usually an indication of excessive nutrient. So whether that's coming from septic systems, which is hard to believe because there aren't a lot of properties there, or whatever the source of nutrient may be, it's not a desirable thing to have. Filamentous algae typically is non-toxic, but it's slimy and it's nasty, and there's always the threat of toxic algae blooms developing. Curly leaf pondweed was found in one location during the survey. Of course, this is an invasive species as well. In that west bay there near the restaurant is where that was seen. Curly leaf pondweed, kind of like milfoil, can be a problem. A lot of times it's not a problem. So, if you had your druthers, you wouldn't have it, but it's quite possible that curly leaf won't become an issue in this lake, but it's definitely something to monitor. So, if another survey is done in future years, it'll be important to see if that's spreading at all. And in terms of milfoil, Eurasian milfoil, the invasive, has not been documented in Wescott Lake, but it is present in Lucille Lake now. And Lucille Lake, of course, is upstream. And so, you want to be vigilant about keeping an eye out for the invasive Eurasian milfoil as well, because it only takes a fragment to take root, and that could wash downstream from Lucille as a possibility. So again, it's in Wescott's best interest possibly to team up with Lucille in terms of addressing these invasive species. Other invasive species that are documented for Wescott Lake are the Chinese and banded mystery snails. These are invasives. There's not really any effective way to eradicate them. So once you have them, you kind of have them. But like some invasive species, they a lot of times they don't become a problem. They're just one of the things that's present. You may or may not have seen them. Populations can explode from time to time. I have seen them on beaches, just covering the beach with crunchy dried shells. But they are what they are. Yellow iris was also observed. That's an invasive, and it can be detrimental just because it doesn't make good natural habitat, and it can start to block out and take over other good native species. So if you ever see yellow iris, and sometimes it's planted as an ornamental, but that's not a good thing to have around. If you ever see that, you'll want to get rid of it. Recreation, it's a no-wake lake, being under 50 acres. So that's probably nothing that's going to change. The boat launch is owned by the town of Bagley, and that's good to know. Some of the boat launches are owned by the Forest Service, some by the county. So there's a wide variety there. In your case, the town manages that boat launch. So good to know who to go to if there are issues or improvements needed with that boat launch. Almost wrapping up here, just a couple more comments I got from the survey. What could be done to improve Wescott Lake? Remove excessive weeds and educate visitors of no wake. So I take it some people have seen visitors not observing the no wake on Wescott. That should obviously be posted at the boat launch if it's not already. And then any additional comments, beautiful and peaceful lake, and need to improve loon nesting habitat. So maybe we can have Brenda or someone speak to possible ways to address that. But that's kind of the summary of what we know about the lake. Here's contact information for Ken, Dale, and myself. So I'd like to open this up to any of you who have questions or comments. You can also contact any of us in the future with questions or comments. Just a reminder that following this meeting, look for in your email, I will start a draft of a lake management plan, and then just be looking for you guys to review that and respond to me with comments or suggestions, things you like, things you don't like, whatever the case may be. And we'll just kind of go through iterations of that draft until you guys have something you're happy with. Again, not having a formal lake organization kind of leaves it up to you individually to do this, unless you guys want to, confer with each other in the meantime. Usually what I do, if I get a comment or a suggestion from an individual, I will send out a new draft, and I'll kind of highlight that thing just so that others can see it and see if they're on board with it or not, so that we get consensus. But so yeah, with that, if anyone has any questions or comments or anything else to add. It's all yours. Brenda, do you know anything about loon habitat or improving loon habitat?
There's an organization called Loon Watch with the Sigurd Olson Institute.
Okay.
I just Googled in Loon Watch in Wisconsin, and all sorts of stuff came up and contacts there, and a whole lot of information about that organization with the email address. I would just email them and tell them what you're thinking, and they'll take it from there. I've seen those, I think we've all seen those folks present before too, so they seem to be pretty informative and helpful with stuff like that.
Yeah, a lot of those groups are just looking for lakes and people to work on. So,
Ryan, can you hear me?
yes, go ahead.
Regarding water quality, did you test for mercury or anything like that?
No, that was not part of the analysis. Mercury, I believe, remind me if you know, but I believe mercury will typically be bound up in the sediment. Is that right, Brenda? there are a lot of mercury issues, you know, due to coal plants and stuff over the decades in a lot of these lakes. I don't hear about it being a problem, and I think that might be because it typically sticks in the sediments, but it does become a problem when those sediments are resuspended, or if you know, if someone's proposing to try and do dredging or something like that, that mercury can be a problem. But we didn't do any tests for it.
Okay, thank you.
No. Yeah, I mean, that's obviously something that can be done if it's, you know, if there's something suspicious, but.
Yeah, that's heavy metal testing that we do, and it usually, you know, would be a result of a concern, you know, from the lake group. I believe they are able to test for it in fish tissue too, but that would obviously have to be really high loading of it as well.
In general, with your lakes, I mean, have you seen problems with mercury in the area at all? Brenda, anything in your area any areas that have mercury issues? Is that a problem in this area typically?
There's some that were identified, oh geez, like 30, 40 years ago. And I don't know, you know, what the half-life is of that. I usually go with those fish consumption charts that we all see. And I don't recall Wescott being on there. I know there were a few lakes up in Lakewood that were kind of higher with mercury. But I'd have to look at the most recent fish consumption chart
Yeah.
to
Okay.
see.
Okay. I don't hear a lot about mercury with the lakes I'm working with. Not to say it wouldn't be something to investigate.
Yeah,
Something-
I was able to pull up the healthy eating guideline that we have, and you know, there's a few flowages in the area like Cauldron Falls and High Falls and Lake Nockabay that have some guidelines for certain types of fish, but you know, Wescott Lake is not listed. I mean, in general, some of the fish that are listed that have issues are typically like bigger game fish. Like for example, for Cauldron Falls flowage, walleye over 17 inches, it's safe to eat up to 1 meal per month. So it's typically your bigger game fish that tend to have the bioaccumulation issues, but I don't really see that being an issue in Wescott Lake necessarily.
Okay. Anything else? Ken, you got anything? Ken fell asleep. I'm that exciting. So yeah, anyway, if you guys don't have anything else, that's basically what we have. Keep a lookout in your email for that draft plan, and let me know your thoughts. And also be sure to, you know, when you receive that draft, feel free to forward that on to others that you think might be interested, or have an opinion one way or the other. Same with that survey. The more heads at the table, the more complete something will get. And we really want to generate something here that people can buy in on and will put to good use. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, and don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Take care.